So after all this talk about closures and execution contexts and first-class functions, your head might be spinning a bit if this is the first time you've ever heard about these concepts. But what if I told you that if you've done any JavaScript programming, even a little, you've probably used these concepts at least once? What if I told you that if you use something like setTimeout or jQuery events, that you're using closures all the time? Let's talk for a second about closures and callbacks. Let's write a simple function called sayHiLater. And I'll create a greeting, hi, and then I'll use a built-in JavaScript function called setTimeout. You may have used this before when you wanted something to happen after a few seconds of waiting. setTimeout, and the setTimeout that's built into JavaScript takes a function of what I want to happen after the timer is done, and then how many milliseconds it should wait until that happens. So I'll just console.log greeting. See that? Then I'll call sayHiLater. So what's going to happen? Well, I refresh and wait. 1, 2, 3. And it logged it. It waited 3,000 milliseconds, that is 3 seconds, and ran this function. Do you realize that you're using function expressions, closures, right now? You see, setTimeout takes a function object. You're passing it as a parameter, so that's making use of first-class functions in JavaScript. And we're creating the function on the fly, so I'm taking advantage of a function expression. So I'm passing a function object and another parameter, the time, to setTimeout. Now sayHiLater then finishes. You may recall early in this course we talked about asynchronous processes and the event loop. Well, setTimeout goes off outside in the browser, counts and waits, and then drops an event when this 3,000 seconds has passed that says, my timeout has finished. And then the engine says, are there any functions listening? And it finds one. And so then it runs this function. But greeting doesn't exist inside this function, and sayHiLater has already finished running. So what happens? Well, exactly what we saw before. It goes up the scope chain, and it has a closure for this variable. It knows the memory space where this was sitting when sayHiLater was running in its execution context. So thanks to the closure, it still has access to greeting 3 seconds later, even though a long time ago, sayHiLater finished running. This only takes milliseconds to run, and yet 3 seconds later, it still has access when this function is executed by the JavaScript engine. So if you've done any code like this, you've already used closures and function expressions. Same thing with jQuery. For those of you that are web developers, if you've done something like maybe you had a button and then you had a click event and you gave it a what? A function. This click is a function. And inside the code in jQuery, it accepts another function to run when that event happens. So you used first-class functions. You passed it as a parameter, and you're using a function expression to declare your function, to set up or define your function at that point. So this is jQuery uses function expressions and first-class functions. Now I don't have jQuery reference, so I'll just comment this out. But do you see what's happening? All along, if you've done some jQuery or some JavaScript programming, at some point you've probably been taking advantage of first-class functions and closures. These functions that do something after you run another function, giving this function to another function and having it execute when it's done, is called a callback function. You're saying, here, take this function, and when you're done working, call the function, execute the function I just gave you. It's a callback. I executed you, and you in turn execute this other function for me when you're done. So, big word alert. A callback function. That's a function you give to another function to be run when the other function is finished. So you call a function, that is, you invoke it, you execute it, and you give it your own function. And then that function calls back by calling the function you gave it when it finishes. So I call function A and give it function B. And when function A finishes running, it calls function B for me. It calls back. Thus the name, a callback function. Let's build a function that takes a callback real quick. Function, tell me when done. And it accepts a callback. And I'll literally just call it callback. You could call it whatever you want. And then let's say that it sets a variable. And then when it's done, I'll do another one just for fun. This could be anything. And then when it's done, it's going to run the callback. And let me call this a couple of times. I'll say tell me when done, and I'll give it a callback function. I'll tell it the function that I'm going to give to it that it should execute. So here I'll say console.log I am done. And I could do this again and have a different callback function. And in this case, I might say I'll console.log, or actually, let's alert I am done. In the browser, the alert will pop up. So let's see. Refresh. Look at that. I am done. I am done. Or I could change this to console.log all done. Do you see what's happening? Oh, and then that high pop from the set timeout. But these callback functions, I gave it to this function. So I called this function, that is, I invoked it, and it called back. It called or executed or invoked the function I gave it. I call you, then you call the function that I gave you. All right. So closures, function expressions, callbacks, these are things that you've likely have some exposure to. You use closures and first-class functions all the time. Let's move on.